My name is Melanie Kress, and I am the Associate Curator for Highline Art, the public art program presented by the Highline in New York City. I want to welcome you all and thank you for joining us for the fourth conversation in our six-part speaker series, The Normalizing Gaze, Surveillance from Drones to Phones. This panel is titled Digital Sanctuary Cities, Surveillance, Immigration, and Protecting Black Dissent. This series is organized in conjunction with artist Sam Durant's Highline Flint Commission, Untitled Drone, which opened this spring and will be on view on the Highline at 30th Street through August 2022. Untitled Drone is a large-scale fiberglass sculpture in the shape of an abstracted drone sitting atop a 25-foot tall steel pole. This work continues Highline Art's mission of presenting new, powerful, thought-provoking artworks that generate and amplify some of today's most important conversations. Inspired by this artwork, the speaker series brings together artists, activists, scholars, filmmakers, and journalists to demystify the twinned histories of surveillance and drone warfare and illuminate routine examples of surveillance in our daily lives. This program is presented by the Highline and Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, a nonprofit advocacy organization and legal services provider that litigates and advocates for privacy, working to abolish local government systems of mass surveillance. We're thrilled to have STOP's Executive Director, Albert Fox-Khan, moderating today's conversation. As we begin, I have a few announcements regarding the logistics of the event. These will also be included in the chat. All attendee videos are automatically turned off and microphones are muted. If you would like to use closed captioning, please go to the button at the bottom of your screen and click on the CC option. Here you will be able to turn on captions. Throughout the presentation and discussion, we invite you to ask questions. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will select from your questions for our moderator. If you have any technical issues, you can also put them in the Q&A. And lastly, in the coming days after the series, a recording of this event will be posted on the Highline's website for future viewing. Thank you again for joining us and for all of our supporters in the audience. Although we are in virtual space together, before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that I come to you today from Brooklyn, New York, on the ancestral land of the Lenape and Canarsie. If you are interested in finding out the names of the indigenous people whose land you may live on, please visit the link in the chat. And I would like to now introduce our event moderator, Albert Fox-Khan. Albert, as I mentioned, is the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, or STOP's founder and executive director. He is also a fellow at Yale Law School's Information and Society Project, Ashoka, NYU Law School's Engelberg Center on Innovation Law and Policy, and the Day One Project. He also serves on the New York Immigration Coalition's Immigrant Leaders Council and the New York Immigrant Freedom Fund Advisory Council. Albert, thank you again for joining us today.
Melanie, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much to Highline Art for arranging this entire series, and particularly today's session, where we're going to delve into one of the most important questions surrounding the surveillance state we know today, the impact it has on undocumented communities and the ways that these technologies are used to enforce immigration restrictions. I'm going to briefly provide introductions for our incredible panel, and then we'll begin the program. So we have a really fantastic group of speakers today. Mizue Aizeki is Deputy Director for the Immigrant Defense Project. Mizue's work focuses on ending the injustices, including criminalization, imprisonment, and exile at the intersections of criminal and immigration systems. Jacinta González is Senior Campaign Organizer with Mijente, a digital and grassroots hub for Latinx and Chicanx movement building and organizing in Phoenix, Arizona. And last but not least, we have Carin Kwaney, who is a curator and writer whose work examines how contemporary artistic practices reflect and shape social, political, and cultural conditions. She is Senior Director and Chief Curator of the Vera Center for Art and Politics at the New School and Assistant Professor of Visual Studies. And with that, I'd like to, Carin, for you to turn on your video and join us, because you'll be starting off today's session with a presentation on some of the artistic elements of this work and the ways that you see these themes reverberating in those media. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Albert. It says that I cannot enable my video because the host needs to approve.
It would not be Zoom without technical difficulties. It is the one constant of these presentations.
Yeah, that is very true. Anyway, so here we are, and I just want to say that I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to participate in this conversation, to speak on the notion of safe spaces, sanctuary, and care as they are approached by artists. I wanted to present 3 projects today where technology is used to subversive effects, amplifying and reinforcing community and political organizing. These 3 projects do so on the one hand by using surveillance and other technologies in ways that they may not have been intended to be used, harnessing them to counter hegemonic effects, but they're also using technology and leveraging their powers of artists to defang and make the technologies more accessible and thus create intimate spaces, safe spaces. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Melanie very much for this wonderful invitation. I am very much looking forward to the conversation, and there are a number of reasons for them. But foremost, it is my deep respect for Sam Durand, with whom we've had the pleasure of collaborating on an exhibition on democracy many years ago at the Vera Center. And it also is a wonderful opportunity to revisit some of the sanctuary-related programs that we did at the Vera Center a couple of years ago. So 3 projects or 3 examples I'd like to discuss. The first one is Mitja Cárdenas' AutoNets, which began in 2012 and is ongoing. The second one is Irena Hajduk's Frauenbank from 2017, and then Marisa Moran-Jan with CareForce, which also is a project that began in 2012. We have little time, so forgive me for just racing through this, and I wonder if I need to make maybe this smaller so you can read the summary of Mitja's project, which is called Find Each Other Local Autonomy Networks, and it's also known as AutoNets. It's focuses on developing networks of communication to increase community autonomy and reduce violence against women, LGBTQI people of color, and other groups who continue to survive violence on a daily basis. And the work does so through 2 elements. One is a localized mesh network or networks that Mitja Cárdenas has developed, and embedded in these networks and the people accessing them is computational clothing. Rather, the networks are embedded in the computational clothing, which are shared with members of certain communities. AutoNet was developed by Mitja Cárdenas, who is an assistant professor of art and design, games and playable media at the University of California in Santa Cruz, where she directs the Critical Reality Studio. And she is just finishing a book entitled Poetic Operations that actually proposes algorithmic analysis to develop a trends of color poetics. And when I show you or play you a video, a brief excerpt in a minute, you'll see just how poetic the work actually is. Mitja is a first-generation Colombian American and also a member of the artist collective Electronic Disturbance Theater 2.0. Before I play this video, let me just emphasize that for Cárdenas and all the artists that I'm going to discuss, networks are both online and offline. They include, in Mitja's case, the handmade, wearable, electronic fashion, and also face-to-face agreements between people. She actually goes so far to consider movement itself as a technology and uses dance and performance to develop networks of community-based responses to violence. Again, AutoNets includes a line of mesh networked electronic clothing to provide locative data, community building methods, theory, and poetry. With these devices, she is able to alert everyone in range of the local mesh network who is wearing another AutoNet garment, and might be someone who needs help, and the device indicates where such a person is. So let's watch just an excerpt of this beautiful piece, which is called Local Autonomy Networks, AutoNets.
Find each other. The Invisible Committee urges us. How do we find each other? How do we find each other? Rows of black helmets with translucent face shields, amber streetlights wash out all color as the crowds undulate and morph like sea creatures. Time shifting, speeds moving between endless waiting and running towards the line of police motorcycles, creating tentacles. The riot cops have blocked all the exits from the camp but one. I try not to lose you because I won't let you be deported, but we both want to be here. Staying close, we talk about Le Guin, the dispossessed, and Uras. Somehow, our presence adds to both the fight and the safety. How do we find help in the moment of violence, the surprising speed of assault, the silence of disappearance? What if that violence is in our intimate places, or in our memories, or farther out of our memories? Can we make networks to respond and not replicate violence? Can we create new logics where we stop putting people in cages? How do we find the ones who will sow insurrection with us, protect us from violence, love and be loved by us, satisfy our bodies? How long do we have to grope in the indigo dark, put out signals, hurl out lines before we find the one, or the ones, who our stories will resonate with? Desire, dance, and queer femme erotics. It's impossible to notice anyone else when you move. Shared care for people named ill connected us. We told each other stories in photos, words, films, light and sound, connecting times in our lives and dreams. Elastic bubblegum bonds sticking, stretching across space-time, folding together our narratives until they touch electrically and kiss deeply. How do we subsist, they ask, in the face of deadly economics, violent racisms, multitudes of Byzantine categorizations of our bodies and our lives? How do we survive? How can we build networks, relationships, span the gaps between individuals, create assemblages, sub-networks, glowing lines of connection and affection, made visible with electroluminescence and soft circuits?
Okay, I am very reluctantly I'm going to pause here just in the interest of time, but I think you get a sense of the poetry, of the language, of the performative aspects of the networks. And at the beginning, you also saw just how they're actually worn, these devices in people's clothing. Important to note that all of the technologies developed collaboratively in workshops and collective design processes, and very much inspired by existing networks of horizontal knowledge production in queer, transgender survivors of gender violence and diasporic communities. Then let me jump ahead and present you very briefly the next project, which is by Irena Hajduk, and it is called Frauenbank, and is basically a closed intranet to create a cooperative organizational structure and then invest in cryptocurrency to create a community of caring and solidarity in physical space, and to actually then buy a plot of land to anchor this community of caring. Irena Hajduk speaks of her Frauenbank as an extended artwork with various manifestations. So there's sculpture containing a web domain, there is a woman's bank, the cooperative, and then there's the actual plot of land. Hajduk was born in Belgrade, Serbia, has an MFA from the University of Illinois in Chicago. She is an assistant professor of professional practice and visual arts at Barnard College and has created long-term projects that she labels oral corporations, which have been featured in numerous institutions and biennials, documentas, and so on. And Frauenbank itself, and we have a picture here, had its beginnings in the Whitney Biennial from 2017. So what we see here is her installation at the Whitney Biennial. It's an object that the tower in the center, mirrored object in this room that contains a web server, which runs on a wireless local area network, the so-called Whitney Frauenbank network. Housed in this mirrored object is the central node of a digital .yu domain, and .yu, the letters come from the former country of Yugoslavia, which no longer exists. So the domain name is this .wu. The device or the node is able to interact with visitors through the visitors' mobile devices. The object presents a video work on all four sides, and it's actually a python giving birth to snake offspring. We'll see that later again, which symbolizes to the artist the birth of a transnational domain, a public space, and a cooperative organization all in one. The 7 boardroom chairs facilitate the required cooperative quorum for the Frauenbank's General Assembly and invite visitors as potential members of the cooperative. The next slide shows you the app that allows you to actually join the members of the cooperative and then invest in this collective community of care, again located in an actual site. Frauenbank itself is built as a decentralized autonomous organization. So we have the idea of autonomy again, as in Micha Cárdenas' project. And in her case, though, in Irena's, the organization sits on the Ethereum blockchain. Through transparent, immutable, and resilient, it is a smart contract that resides within the globalized, decentralized peer-to-peer network that all the members of the cooperative have access to and are members of. The Frauenbank offers membership to women visitors at the Whitney or wherever the machine, the sculpture is, who are invited to become voting members by securely purchasing shares through their local .yu network. All members have one vote in all matters decided by the Frauenbank cooperative and so on. There is a wonderfully also humorous details about who is able to join and what role women play in this cooperative versus men. So I am showing you just a few pages of the app, the way it appeared on your phone in the Whitney Biennial if you were close to the server. And you can see that there's explanations of the goal of the project, how you access it. Let me just see if I can speed this up a bit. How you sign up, who the other members might be, what the blockchain currency actually looks like, and what you acquire when you buy one. Here's the community. And then this outlook to actually owning a piece of land. You have here a map. And you see here on this slide that there's actually a piece of land in Serbia that is open for foreign purchasers or owners, so to speak. And this is the piece of land that this collective or this cooperative bank, through the app, through that intranet from the Whitney Biennial out, is able to buy or purchase. Then more information and so on. I think maybe this is all I can show you. And just in closing, a reminder with this lovely image of kind of the symbol for this site of, somewhat utopian care-focused or care-driven communal living on a small plot in Serbia. The members' donations impact the physical domain by acquiring parcels of land in the former Yugoslavian territory of Serbia, and the Frauenbank itself is registered as a non-profit organization in the Republic of Serbia to support, and I'm quoting here, women in the arts and women-led production ecosystems in the Balkans. And in that way, the work transgresses institutional, legal, and geographic boundaries. The last slide for this project, and then I will speak briefly about CareForce, which is Marissa Moran-Jan's project that she developed since 2012 in collaboration with the National Domestic Workers Alliance. It is a project that amplifies the voices of America's fastest growing workforce, caregivers, and this was the intent of the project when it began in 2012, and obviously the workforce in this segment has only grown since the pandemic. CareForce consists of various two mobile studios, dances, printed work, and an actual video or documentary, CareForce One Travelogues. The Care House, which is an intergenerational care-based co-housing project in Baltimore that is scheduled to be completed. It's an actual building in, I think, 2023. But I really want to talk briefly about the app that Marissa developed for domestic workers, which was called or named one of the 5 apps that will change the world by CNN. The app essentially is a Know Your Rights audio novella app for domestic workers, but available via any kind of phone, since it came out before smartphones were widely available. The way it works is that you call a number and then you auto-navigate through the informational portals in order to access humorous, need-to-know audio novellas. Here in the first slide, we see a recording session. Marissa is the person in the center and is recording advice and suggestions by various experts dedicated to domestic workers and their safety. A word on Marissa briefly. She's an artist, she's a filmmaker and a creative technologist of Ecuadorian and Chinese descent, and has, among her numerous art projects, she also started an organization, non-profit, it's called Studio Rev, and is dedicated to co-designing public art and creative media together with low-wage workers, immigrants, and women. And this project, the CareForce, is coming out of the Studio Rev work. She teaches regularly at Columbia, at MIT, from which she graduated, at the New School, where she's an assistant professor of design strategies. So here you see how she collects the information, how she distributes the information about the app. So there are these kind of business cards with fun, engaging graphics that people in bilingual and many other, more than just 2 languages, a way to reach a network and activate a network of domestic workers. And in the end, I'm going to play you just a short segment of the audio.
Woohoo! Woohoo! Not for long. Timesheets and record keeping. Mijas, hear that cuckoo clock? She's reminding you, keep good records of your hours worked and wages paid. Your personal. This is Clara. I'm a hamster.
Okay, this is a little short, but I thought it would be necessary, and I, so that we have enough time to hear from everyone else, but you get a sense of the dynamic and fun atmosphere that people enter as they dial the number and use the app and have access to vital information for their lives. Maybe in closing, just let me summarize briefly that all of these projects are generated collaboratively. All of them are long-term. They all reside on multiple platforms. They are diverting the intended recipient of a technology and really make the technology available to audiences and publics that would not necessarily have been the primary recipient or target of them. And I think that's one of the key strategies that these artists have developed. So less about sanctuary cities than sanctuary spaces, but I hope it's a useful introduction to our topic today.
No, that's an incredible introduction. Thank you so much, Carin. And I really do think it is so important when we're delving into a discussion that will look at a lot of the ways that these technologies are weaponized against communities, to also center the examples of the ways that communities can use these technologies themselves. Because I think, for me at least, it's a reminder of some of the lost potential for what the openness that we hoped that, the internet and technology more broadly would one day bring us. But instead, we went down a very different path. And with that, I'd like to bring Mizue and Jacinta into the conversation. And starting off this next section and turning to the panel discussion, I want to contrast what we just saw with the ways that these technologies can be deployed, with the ways that we've seen centralized agencies use technology in a very different way. And I think, when we're talking about the role of surveillance technology, in our communities, it's not often this community-led effort, this decentralized effort. Instead, it is a very government-centered, corporate-centered effort. And so, look, why don't we start off by looking at what is the broader state of the national security state, the surveillance state that, in cities after 20 years of post 9/11 America? Where do we find ourselves today? And how does that reality contrast with the sort of the optimistic view of technology we saw from the amazing artists that Carin showed us? And maybe Jacinta, we'll start with you and then go to Mizue.
What we do have to realize is that with all of technology, there's tremendous potential to help, create wonderful things that will get us to be more connected, to have more transparency, to be in closer community with each other. And I think particularly thinking of the app designed for the National Domestic Workers Alliance, thinking about the ways that can help support organizing. I think what we have to be careful of is the fact that this is also, especially since the 90s, I would say that, tech companies, data companies have been really kind of pushing because they're advertising their own products, right? That technology can make everything quicker, can make everything better, can make everything smarter, less biased. And so, there's a lot of ways in which the data economy and more surveillance has impacted the global economy. I love to tell people that data is now worth more than oil, right? Worth more than gold in terms of the global economy, like what that's doing in terms of how it's shaping businesses, how it's shaping advertising, how it's shaping democracy in terms of our access to information. But I think something that we've looked at very particularly as Mijente is how it's also shifting and changing policing, right? What happens when these types of technologies are actually in the hands of policing agencies that have a huge history of racism, that have a huge history of abuse of power, that have a huge history of violence? The consequences are very different. And so I'll actually pass it over to Mizue, because I think, being based in New York, both having the experience of what happened after 9/11, but also really tracking the history of, coming out of 9/11, creating the Department of Homeland Security, and having particularly Immigration and Customs Enforcement as a policing agency that's not only in charge of policing migration, but is also really an international surveillance agency, how that's really changed the landscape in which we're operating. So I'll pass it over to you, Mizue, to kind of get into that part.
Thanks, Jacinta. So just following up on what Jacinta just said, and your question, Albert, immigrants and other targeted communities currently face, as we know, or maybe we don't know, unprecedented levels of surveillance. And it's all, where the war on terror converges with the war on immigrants is this idea that particular people, whether it's a Black and brown immigrants, Black and brown communities, Muslims, immigrants with criminal contact, recent border crossers, they all represent this perpetual threat, right? As well as the misleading idea that, using tech and surveillance to exclude people or incarcerate them or to monitor them is a humane alternative to physical walls and physical cages, right? And as Jacinta mentioned, as Department of Homeland Security founded in 2002, and ICE, the Immigration Policing Agency, founded in 2003, over the past 20 years, the budget for policing migrants, whether at the border or whether globally, DHS has 52 offices around the world, and in the interior has more than tripled, right? And this is a process that started well before 9/11. But if you think about the tremendous amount of resources, I think it's something like the Border Patrol budget has increased 6,000% since 1980, right? And this is continually an upward escalation in terms of federal resources going into this. In terms of places like New York City, what has been really significant and changing the landscape of policing since 9/11 is both the creation of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, which is dedicated to policing immigrants, primarily in the interior. I think when they first started ICE in 2003, they had 8 teams of ICE agents. Now there's probably, upwards of at least 130, but those aren't the only teams, right? Now we have the Homeland Security investigation. We have other ICE officers that are at any time can kind of come together and conduct what we've seen, these mass raids or daily raids in different cities and towns across the country. And then we also have seen this increasing entanglement or merger of domestic policing and ICE policing, right? So maybe you all have heard of what we call the police to deportation pipeline. But one of the things that has really characterized, I think, this moment of Homeland Security now is contact with local domestic policing is now a pipeline into the immigration deportation system. And not just materially, right? Not just that your fingerprints are also getting sent, but also the logics of it, right? The logics of policing and the idea that certain people are dangerous, perpetually dangerous, as I mentioned earlier, and therefore they should be surveilled and tracked and monitored in all different kinds of ways is the current state of migrant policing, both at the border and in the interior and globally.
It really has been this massive transformation of every aspect of our immigration system, of our policing system, of our national security system. I think, looking back at those decades of changes, it's almost staggering. It's hard to take it in all at once. And an aspect of this I wanted to touch on was, this thought of how do we create a safe space amid this, hyper militarized immigration system. Here in New York, I hear all the time from people who say, but we're a sanctuary city, but we have that protection. And yet we know that families are still being ripped apart. So maybe we can talk a bit about the ways that, even within communities that claim to provide sanctuary, that claim to provide the sort of safe spaces that the artist Carin referenced, we're building and demonstrating. we're actually failing to live up to that promise. And happy to start with anyone for that.
I'm happy to jump in on this one, Albert. I think it's helpful, Mizue sort of explained to us what happened with the creation of DHS and ICE back in 2003. And, it's very clear that from the beginning, ICE had its mission of being able to identify, detain, and deport all undocumented people in the US, right? The broader 11 million. They quickly realized that with their first original 8 little teams, they weren't going to be able to do that, right? They were, doing mass raids. They were using a lot of racial profiling, but they quickly figured out that they had to really grow their network of folks that they had at their disposal to help surveil people, identify them, to help create more detention space, and help, sort of speed up the deportation machinery. And so the first place that they started to do that was with local police agencies and with local jails and prisons, right? So they started to create programs like 287G, where they would come into a city and train a local sheriff, right? I'm thinking about Joe Arpaio in Phoenix, Arizona, where they would train these sheriffs into being able to help them do their own raids and help identify people in their own jail to be able to transfer them. Then Obama sped this up with programs like Secure Communities that, has a beautiful, lovely name, but actually just means that it's creating a pipeline between local law enforcement and deportation. So anyone that was picked up on a traffic ticket or picked up for any sort of contact with the police would then automatically be funneled into deportation because their fingerprints were being shared with ICE, and ICE would go into the local jail. What we started to see at the end of the Obama administration and throughout Trump is that this wasn't enough for ICE, right? As Mizue was explaining, they're constantly growing. They're constantly trying to figure out how to have a bigger budget and have more power and control. And so they found their new ally, which was tech and data companies. And so for that reason, Immigrant Defense Project, Mijente, and several other groups did a research project to basically expose who are the tech and data companies that are working with ICE to create this deportation machinery. And what we found is that there's a huge network, right, of data brokers, right, companies that buy and sell information, like Thomson Reuters and LexisNexis. Some folks that are watching might be like, wait, isn't that the legal research company, or aren't they a publisher? No, it turns out they're actually buying bulk data on people's addresses and people's whereabouts that ICE is directly using to create their target list for raids. You'll have companies like Palantir, companies like Amazon, companies like Clearview AI that are doing facial recognition technology, cloud services, data analytics. And so in this way, ICE has really sort of expanded their power and expanded their reach to be able to surveil people in order to conduct their raids, in order to fill up the detention beds, and then ship people out. And so I think what we're starting to realize is that this is the new frontier, not only of ICE policing, but policing in general. These same data brokers that are working with the federal government are now starting to work more and more with local governments. The same companies that start to have their, Clearview AI, for example, they start to have their contract with ICE, but then they start to promote it and try to sell it to local law enforcement agencies. And so we see that in general, this is sort of the next frontier of policing and also of incarceration, right? More and more what we're seeing is that not only are we seeing those brick and mortar prisons, right, where they're able to hold people, but an expansion of also digital ankle shackles, right, or digital prisons that are using GPS location tracking devices and different, even apps on your phone to be able to track and control people. So what we're seeing that in a lot of ways, the militarization of the border is also part of the militarization of policing. And the way that tech and data companies are seeing this is a new form of doing business, right? So we're seeing that it's not only the government that has in their interest to try to criminalize and marginalize certain communities, but whenever companies start to see that that's the politic of the day, they figure out how they can make a buck off of it and start to kind of accelerate that same process.
Completely agree. And as someone who is actively suing Thomson Reuters at the moment, I'm very glad you named them among many of the other awful companies. And Carin, I have a question for you, which goes to sort of the path that we've gone down. And this seems like a very in some ways a fluke of history, and it's easy to imagine a different world where we could have used technology the way that Cardenas did to help people who are in need connect with their community, to bring people together. But as we're hearing from Jacinta and Mizue, a lot of the reality for immigrant communities is that technology has often been more a tool of oppression than a tool of connection. And do you have any thoughts on why we ended up going down this path, or whether there's hope to go down another?
Well, I think there is hope the moment we maybe ignore scale. And if we are realistic or modest or creative enough to think that the intimacy of a community, even if it's small, is valuable, is influential, and has effects on a larger scale once it becomes known, or the technology or how it was used becomes better known or more available. So that's one thing I want to say. These examples that I brought in, I mean, they're very small compared to what Jacinta and Mizue are dealing with. It's a group of women who create a feminist bank. It's immigrants in California, and then it's another project. So scale, I think, matters. The other thing I want to say is also that institutions, in some ways, and maybe cultural or art institutions in more significant ways, have the ability to frame these engagements and these initiatives in a way that makes them more safe and more protected, and also possibly more influential. And here I'm raising the question of what is achieved, or what changes when these organizing technologies or methodologies become declared art. If we say this is an art project and it is presented as part of a certain initiative, or it's part of a biennial, or it's part of a institution, what kind of agency do we buy or acquire that way, and what kind of visibility and what kind of spaces do we create as cultural producers by inviting projects into our into our institutions? On the one hand, of course, the moment something is declared art, it's just it's off. It's no longer relevant. It's just art, or it could be seen that way, but it also acquires a certain liberty and freedom and agency that it may not have outside, for instance, the museum walls. And two examples that come to mind is, for instance, the Immigration Monument International, which was a long-standing project that Cuban artist Tania Bruguera launched in collaboration with the Queen's Museum. It was outside of the museum, but it was a museum initiative to create a peer learning situations for undocumented immigrants in Queens, where they would learn all kinds of things, from legal information to languages to certain skills. And all of it was couched and also softened and protected by it being an art museum or art project. And the other example would be a project that was positioned as if it were, or it was positioned as part of the Whitney Biennial. And it was the most recent, the biennial 4 years ago. Biennial usually starts in March. On January 20th in 2016, the Whitney called for a day long of reflections on what this new US administration would mean for cultural producers. And it was an incredibly courageous invitation for anyone to come and speak about our concerns, fears, worries, looking at the incoming Trump administration on January 20th. It was possible to do this because it was done as part of the biennial, which hadn't even opened yet. But here we were in this room, sharing very openly, was also available online, all of our concerns under the protective shield of it's just an art project. And the museum was not responsible for what was said. And so those seem important considerations. The framing, the context, the certain freedom or license we can get by declaring something in artwork. And I think also really, really important to think of scale and intimacy differently than just in terms of numbers.
Such an important point. So, I mean, we have seen, particularly in the last 5 years, such incredible work from cultural institutions across the country in taking on a social justice mission and recognizing their unique capacity, both as conveners and as spaces that are insulated from a lot of the political retaliation that other organizations might face. That leads me into a question for Mizue, but before I get to that, I just want to invite everyone in the audience to please submit your questions. We'll be answering those certainly at the end, but we'd like to get to those throughout and make sure that we're addressing the topics that are most of concern to you. And Mizue, looking at the point that Carin made about scale, I think it's really important to look at the scale of these issues in New York City specifically. And I think, with the, sanctuary city issues that Jacinta was telling us about before and the sorts of data sharing, I was hoping that you could give us the local New York City perspective on how this city's promises of protecting undocumented New Yorkers have actually played out in practice, especially over the last 20 years.
That's a good question. I think in terms of scale, one of the things that is really challenging about the immigration issue is it operates on multiple scales, right? It's a local issue, clearly. There's some things that states can do, such as trying to limit sharing of the Department of Motor Vehicles information for undocumented drivers to ICE. And then there's obviously the laws that are set at the federal level and the decisions that are made from administration to administration on who to target. And I think kind of bringing it back to something that Jacinta said, when ICE was founded in 2003, they made it very clear, right, that they want to identify, track, and arrest identify and track every person that they could in order to decide when they wanted to arrest and detain and deport them, right? And so it's like ICE, operates like any policing agency, is they have discretion, but they always talk about we can only detain and deport this many people, right? So the idea being that if they had more money and more resources, then they could deport more people. And I think, we have under every presidential administration, whether it's George Bush, Obama, Trump, to Biden now, there's always a different enemy, right? Where we had, Bush very much targeting the Muslim communities with the NYPD, right, in New York City. That was like the early war on terror profile. And then these massive raids of undocumented people in places like Long Island, right? And I think when we went to Obama, we had this police infrastructure of the police to deportation pipeline, the automatic sharing of fingerprints and other information collected at arrests being moved to ICE. And this is where we saw a lot of the organizing in New York City and across the country to try to stop this fingerprinting. We were told that it was mandatory, that we couldn't stop it. Then there was this organizing to stop police and jails from cooperating with ICE, right? When ICE issues these requests to turn people over. And we've had varied success with that, right? And I will say that, you know, in New York City, we fought really hard for the policy to limit ICE police collaboration and Rikers collaboration with ICE. And that has been successful to a certain extent, but it still comes with challenges, right? I think the idea of ICE then now going out into communities, going to courthouses, trying to pick people up, and they will make really clear that the reason why they're doing this, why they're targeting places like New York or California and other places, is because of these policies that are put in place. And so I get your question, Albert. I just feel a little bit like it's important to continue to organize and push our cities and localities to do as much as they can. But I also think that it's important to recognize that part of the goal of the surveillance infrastructure is to undermine our organizing, right? And so we are really fighting hard. And I think Jacinta has been focused on that issue. So maybe you wanted to talk a little bit about that, Jacinta?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue really is like, as long as we have ICE, we're always going to have this problem. There's always going to be a new way, a new mechanism. And so I think both, as much as we're, like you're saying, fighting against the surveillance or fighting against the local ways that we can actually put some limits, that as a federal and really an international surveillance agency, they're always going to find a way to go around some of these things. I think that's part of the dangers of data brokers. I think that's part of the danger of data analytics, that unless there's actual big global shifts in terms of how we're seeing some of these issues, we're going to continue to have the problem. And really, this is something that a lot of times people are like, but how is that constitutional? It's like, actually, we have to even reimagine the way we think of constitutional protections, because the Fourth Amendment is not really cutting it, particularly with the Supreme Court, in terms of actually giving us the tools that we need. So, you know, I remember at one time when we did an interview with whether it was Snowden, we're like, well, how do organizers protect themselves? And he's like, you're like this big against $10 billion company, right? Like, we actually also have to understand the power dynamics at play to also be able to really both be able to give people concrete things that we can organize around, and also kind of take a step back to really understand the scale, so that we can actually like properly assess what we're facing.
Maybe if I could just chime in briefly. I was just this afternoon at some panel discussion, Zoom panel discussion, hosted by the Mellon Foundation, and Paul Farber of Monument Lab in Philadelphia spoke wonderfully, but pointed to two concepts that are intricately intersecting or aligned, and they are the question of symbol and the question of systems, and one cannot be seen without another. And of course, coming from Monument Lab, which is dedicated to looking at the manifestations of power in public space through monuments, you know, you immediately associate with the symbol a statue or, you know, something very tangible. But I do think the incredibly important work that is being done by my co-panelists, you know, there's no reason not to acknowledge not that you wouldn't, the significance of the symbolic and the poetry and these harrowing, beautiful, small and intimate art projects that are really functioning on the symbolic level in many ways, but can trigger, you know, can have great impact, I would think.
I think that is also a very powerful point. I, again, just want to invite everyone in the audience to submit your questions. We've already had a couple and would love to see more. And the point around symbolism makes me think of this. Is the border itself symbolic, or is it actually a real entity? And I ask that because we talk about the border as if it's a static, finite, clear-cut thing, but the practice of what counts as the border zone, this expanded border powers, that seems to be incredibly amorphous, incredibly unclear, and to bear no resemblance to the nice, bright lines we see drawn on maps. And I would invite any of you to answer that.
I'm not very poetic, but I will say for many people, it's a very real place. And it's increasingly real in the sense that these are lines that are imaginary, right? But they're just getting increasingly concretized, right? So something that a piece of territory that used to be, indigenous land and then used to actually be for decades, centuries, people would cross freely, is now, has riddled with motion detectors, right? Night vision cameras, thousands of police drones, all these different technologies, not just in the United States, but also in Europe as well, in Australia. It's a global industry, right, of border fortification, which is very much, a continuum of the very, the histories related to colonialism and conquest and empire. And I think that, part of what we do need to imagine is a different solution, right? Or a different way of framing what the problem is, right? The problem isn't that people need to move and migrate, right? The problem is that these lines exist and they're fortified in order to maintain control of certain people over other people, right? And it's economic control, political control, cultural control, and these have now become lines that determine who gets to live and who gets to thrive, and others who are then regarded as disposable. And, I do think that it is really important to recognize how these things do change over time, right? So like, even I'm not young, but I'm not that old. And I remember going down to the border at Tijuana and seeing something very different than we see now, right? And I think that for many people, and for those of us who can hold that memory, part of that is a responsibility to keep it alive, in terms of envisioning a world different than how we live now. And I think, I don't know, I think that there's a lot more to say about that, but I also think that it's really important to recognize that these are political decisions, right, that are bolstered by what Jacinta keep talking about now, a huge industry that's just, it's Silicon Valley, right? It's IT, it's these data brokers, and it's also these military contractors, right? And kind of how we're seeing this global industry build out, that we can't think of it as being limited to that line, but like very far into the interior of the United States, but also pushing out globally.
And I was going to ask Jacinta, I would love to hear your reaction to that. If you could also just, help us take a step back, and for folks who aren't as familiar with what data brokers are and how they operate, even though we all have been impacted by them, give a bit of a brief encapsulation of what that world is.
Definitely. So before we get into data brokers, I do just want to talk about this issue around the border, because I do think there is this, borders are very real. It's a very real location. It's a very real, for folks that have lived in the border regions for centuries, right? They've really seen how militarization and surveillance has increased and really changed the way that they live and the way that their communities interact with one another. But I think what we have to be really careful with is the way that technology is impacting the conversation that we have around migration and border, right? I think part of the reason that both Democrats and Republicans have been able to play political football with issues around migration for a long time is that there's always been this concept of trade-offs. We will legalize this many million if we are able to deport this many million. Or once we secure the border, then we'll able to provide a path to citizenship for quote unquote good immigrants that are worthy of that privilege. And what we've seen with time is that we've just seen a growing militarization of the border, more enforcement, more policing, while the path to citizenship has never arrived, right? And we're literally in the midst of, once again, those broken promises getting to communities, as Democrats have been unable to deliver something concrete in this reconciliation process. So I think that what we've been seeing is even from Joe Biden, right? In his first day of office, he introduced a bill providing a pathway to citizenship for the 11 million, but included in that was this concept of, but we must invest in the smart border wall, right? We don't need the border wall that Trump proposed, right? We don't need concrete and cement and high fences. What we need is to make more investments in technology and surveillance, and that this is going to keep us safe. And, you know, for some folks that might make sense, but when we actually look at what those contracts look like, it's a huge invasion of people's privacy. And border is not just one little fine line that people imagine at the southern border between the US and Mexico. It's actually 100 miles into the interior and includes all ports. So all airports, 100 miles from any border. And that's how all of a sudden you understand how Border Patrol can use drones in Detroit when there's protests, or why CBP is helping conduct arrests in Portland, Oregon, right? So if you can imagine that they have that much surveillance and use that much violence against white moms in Portland, imagine what they're doing to Black and brown migrants on the southern border. And so in this way, there's this growth of militarization with this excuse of fortifying the border. And what we're seeing is that it's growing internationally. This has now become the international model. So as economic instability, political, issues, climate change are forcing more and more people to have to migrate, this idea of having a militarized border and surveillance, international surveillance agencies is growing as the model of controlling migration. So not only do you have Border Patrol on horseback, whipping people in South Texas, but you also have that same law enforcement agency training people in Panama and Colombia to make sure that migrants aren't able to even get into Central America, right? So the idea and the concept of border is actually growing and expanding, not only within the continental US, but internationally as well. And that's why now you have a border militarization industry, right? Turns out it's the same companies, you talk about Raytheon, you can talk about Northrop Grumman. These are military contractors that used to just make technology for wars, like the war in Afghanistan, and are now realizing that they can make equally lucrative contracts by working for agencies like CBP. And so this is the way that this kind of industry continues to grow and expand in a lot of ways that are really dangerous, and that we probably won't be able to realize the full impact of it until 10, 20 years from now, right? When we're having to try to figure out how to unpack it. So that's why for us, it's been so important. And Mijente is going to be putting out a report on this in the next couple of weeks to actually describe for organizers, what are the technologies that are meant when we talk about the smart border wall? What are the implications, not only for migrants trying to cross that border wall, but for folks in general who are trying to organize and protest state violence and state control? And data brokers are a big part of that. Even CBP has contracts with companies like LexisNexis and Thomson Reuters. And what these companies are doing is they're buying bulk data, many times information, for example, from people's utilities, right? So people's addresses, people's locations, people's GPS, what they look for on the internet, and are selling it to, it gets sold to agencies, and that's how it gets into the hands of ICE. And then ICE uses this data to be able to create their target list for when they do raids in people's communities, for when they do raids in people's workplaces. So, there's this huge industry that, again, we'll have states like New York that will say, my Office of Motor Vehicles will not share information with ICE. That's great. But if a data broker is able to get it, right, from the insurance company, from the license plate information, and then sell it to somebody else who sells it to somebody else, who then sells it to Thomson Reuters, that's how ICE is able to access it and put it into their systems. And this is why Palantir is also a really important company, because they have custom-made software for ICE to be able to analyze a lot of that data as well. And so that's the way that they're able to sort of package it, create files on people, and then not only, detain people and deport them, but also criminally prosecute them and put them in prison before they start the deportation process.
It's all so bleak. It's all so heartbreaking. It's all so enraging. And particularly the sort of normalization we see in a lot of the political debate around what a quote smart border wall means. And I think you started to get into some of the technologies that compose it, but I think for a lot of folks it would be helpful to know what other specific tools are we seeing deployed at the border to sort of expand the power of the government to track and to target immigrant communities.
I mean, you have a wide range of technologies, everything from, cell phone towers that are also cell phone towers, tracking towers that are created by companies that, are pretty openly pro-Trump and have been around sort of promoting his agenda, right? Companies like Anduril that have been creating some of these technologies. A lot of these technologies are also experimental, I should say, right? They took them from video games and are trying to adapt them to the border to try to be able to prove that they can identify folks crossing in the middle of the night, but there's actually not proven to be able to function that way. But you also have companies that are breaking into people's cell phones. You also have companies that are doing facial recognition technology, license plate tracking, right? That's a big part of data brokers. You have drones. And so again, it's important for people to remember that folks live in those regions. And so when folks are just literally trying to walk home, trying to walk to school, that means that there's constant surveillance in terms of just watching their every move and also kind of interfering with the natural landscape, right, with the environment in those regions, because they're also having to impose them there. So the report will be coming out next month, sorry, and so folks will be able to get a little bit more of a full range of not only the technologies but the companies behind some of this, and we'll be offering a webinar as well for folks that want to learn more about all of those technologies.
And Mizue, I was hoping you might be able to tell us a bit about the cost of these technologies, not the monetary cost, but the impact it has on individuals who, are subjected to this. And I'm thinking of things like electronic shackles, or even when that electronic shackle is turned from a anklet into an app on someone's phone. What does that mean in terms of the lived experience of someone who has to go through that sort of invasive surveillance?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. Part of what is so challenging, or what am I trying to say? As a form of control, what is so terrible about this is because it is the constant monitoring and the tracking, but also subjecting people to, these practices that just enhance the control of ICE, policing agencies like ICE, but also undermines people's ability to, keep their job, right? So for example, when ICE subjects people to these ankle shackles, it's not just that you have this, it is terrible that you have this GPS tracking device attached to your body. Sometimes it burns people's skin. So you have to, if you work in a school, for example, it sets off the metal detector. You have to find a place to charge it. We've talked to people who have had to change their job, right, so that they could comply with the requirements of ICE supervision. It's also extremely up to the ICE officer and what they want to subject people to, right? So they might say you start out with, we need you to be at home at a particular time, or they'll do like a surprise visit to your home, or they have this telephone app, SmartLink app that Jacinta mentioned, that you have to, do these telephonic check-ins, but it's all very much linked to a system of kind of control. And then the end game is that they'll just decide when they want to deport you, right? If your deportation proceeding is over. And I think part of what we keep trying to, the laws that increase people's rights in relationship to immigration haven't changed, right? For what, 35 years now? But the ability for the federal government to control and track and monitor and exclude and lock up people just continues to grow and grow and grow. And I think this is the thing that we're trying to, that we're continually fighting. And I will just say one more thing about this is, this merger between the domestic police and ICE is deep and profound, right? So where you have not only shared technologies or shared information, right? The data, fingerprints are being shared, any information collected by license plate readers is being shared. But then there's also these joint task forces, right? Where we have ICE police join forces with NYPD, with the DOJ, and they conduct these mass raids. And we also have these fusion centers where there's all this information being brought together by different policing agencies. And so what we're challenged with right now is the incredible ability of the government to not only track people and catalog certain people, right, but to increase the power of the state. They call themselves force multipliers, right, of who's getting policed and who's getting targeted. And then also like all these technological tools that then aid in making certain people visible.
And Carin, one thing that I'm thinking about with a lot of the examples you shared, the technology was bringing people together in digital communities, but it often was in geographically distinct communities at the same time. Do you see examples of of similar work being done to create a sense of community that transcends a lot of these national borders at a time when we see our nations being more and more walled off by the hyper militarism that Jacinta and Mizue described?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Albert. Yes, of course I do. Not because I'm kind of an optimist or artsy thinker as a matter of principle, but I think what we've also seen with the this pandemic times is the ability to really connect to people far away, and there are numerous collectives and cooperatives and organizations that are really arising now and are occupying a online space, and they're mutual aid societies and all kinds of wonderful examples. But Albert, I also wanted to briefly speak to what you phrased, I thought, very, very perceptively as the practice of border. And it speaks to what Jacinta also said, the border is not just a little line. It really is, deeply inside the country. And it's very much also it's a legal construct, but it's also a frame of mind in a way. So going back to your earlier question about indigenous practices and who would deny obviously the legitimacy of a border or even the usefulness of any type of border, might be interesting to think of an artist called Carolina Caicedo, who is Colombian, lives on the West Coast, is currently a fellow with us, and speaks of her own body or site where she is as a container vessel for water. And of course, that's not just confined to her body, but it's all around us. And so if you're able, and I realize, and she certainly does too, it requires certain preconditions, but if you're able to see your body as simply one portal of a transnational system of fluid that we are all connected to, it doesn't allow you to just cross the border and move from the US to Mexico, but it does allow you to see your exchange and impact and agency in a much larger context. So someone like her, I think, is very important, and many, many other indigenous artists are, I think, exemplary in showing the way of how to deny the legitimacy and the importance of borders. And again, not because everyone can do that, but it's important to even deny them the importance in a way. So another example would be Post-Commodity, which is an indigenous collective. They're also based in the Southwest, and they created something called Repellent Fence. And it was a sequence of weather balloons, very, very large balloons that were suspended on long ropes, I guess, and crossed the border perpendicularly. So you could see from, and there was like 2 miles into both countries, and you could just see from miles and miles, and there was this line of balloons, and that's all it was. It was just balloons. It wasn't there for long, but as an image, it was significant.
No, and images can be tremendously powerful in this debate because, we've seen our entire social definition of what it means to have these borders, and what it means, the way Mizue was describing the border that we used to have with Tijuana versus the one we have today, and having a way to visualize a different world, a more open world, is incredibly important. And I want to, I know our time is drawing to an end, but I wanted to turn to one of the newer technologies that we see on the horizon that has the power to really transform a lot of this discussion, and that's with the rollout of so-called smart cities. All of these technologies that we see being promised as a solution to seemingly intractable dilemmas with modern life, whether it's how our trash is picked up, how people are assigned to schools, or even elements of policing. But there's an intersection here with a lot of the risks that we've talked about with contemporary immigration enforcement. I was hoping we could talk about that. Maybe Mizue, if you could begin that, and then we could turn to Jacinta.
Sure. Yeah, I think that there is, tech is obviously everywhere in our homes, and being latched on by cities as a way to become more efficient and to centralize information. I think, sorry, it's getting late for me. But in terms of I think
it is for all of us. You're only human.
I'm only human. So, part of this issue around data, as Jacinta mentioned, data is more valuable than gold. There's a big push on this idea of data for good, right? So we gather as much information as we can on everybody, try to consolidate it. We use it to make predictions, right? Like, how likely are you to actually be a good employee? Or, we hear predictive policing. How likely are you to potentially commit a crime? And I think also governments think of this as something that could become very useful to them. If we knew how much, Albert's using the subway and where he goes, then this could be something that to make our systems more efficient. Part of the problem is, as we all know, that data is also very much coveted by police, right? So where we see, these tap and go systems for subway systems around the world, everywhere they exist, their police are found to tap into them, right? The Oyster card in England, this is very well documented. And obviously, like the Metro card here in New York, the NYPD taps into that as well. And so this is where the problems become. It's the same people, right, that become part of the virtual lineup that are always the potential suspects. And all this information that's gathered can be used either to, from a policing perspective, to conduct surveillance and tracking of certain people, but also from a government perspective, to come up with more reasons to deny certain people benefits, right? Or to basically say, well, we need to do this because of fraud. And I think other studies and research has shown, and experience has shown, that a lot of the same dynamics and systems that fuel oppression and fuel marginalization become embedded into these systems of tech and data collection.
And Jacinta, anything you'd like to add on that point?
No, I think to me, there's just one thing that is important for folks to realize is that the more data we're creating, the more data that police is going to have access to. And so it's both a question of, if we're not able to resolve the issues around how data brokers, particularly in the data economy, is allowing all law enforcement agencies to go around the Constitution, to go around these protections, to just have access to people's information, the more data we're creating, the more we're just putting it into the hands of police. And so for us, it has to be a dual issue of both addressing issues around data brokers and addressing issues around policing and police violence, particularly given its racist origins and racist practices that continue to date.
Well, we're almost out of time, but I wanted to give each of you just a minute to give any parting thoughts that you have, because we've covered a lot here. I know we've talked about a huge array of issues, but just one note that you'd like to leave the audience with as we close out the session. Maybe we can start with you, Carin, and then Mizue, and then Jacinta.
I'm, obviously, like we all do, speaking from my own perspective, but talking to the point of, data being gold and a question of value and resources, that is, to me, at the very least center, and, that would apply to many other cultural organizations as well. It's an incredibly interesting question of, what is actually valuable, what is a resource, what is power, and what is necessary for us to kind of realign and our own, or reconsider our own understanding of power and the power we have. And in our daily practice as cultural producers, acknowledge the presence of entities or systems that are not necessarily considered or recognized as powerful, but that actually are. So for us as a cultural institutions, it would be the public, it is the students at the new school, it is the land we're sitting on, the land we're conferring on, that we've occupied without being invited into. And all of that allows you to consider data differently, legal system differently. But it also, I would hope, emboldens us to make demands from a position of strength and legitimacy and conviction and a sense of power.
Thank you. And Mizue.
I just wanted to end with thanks you all for listening, but also this idea when we talked about the border is like how we imagine something that we recognize that the threat that is being addressed by more policing, whether it's local policing or ICE policing or at the border, is a constructed threat, right? These are ideas that have been developed and designed to increase the power of some people at the human cost to other people. And so that we have to challenge these constructed threats, but also, another world is possible, right? Like 20 years ago, there were no ICE agents roaming the streets looking to raid and arrest people, right? There weren't these technologies developed to the point that they are, that Jacinta is talking around at the border. And I think we have to, really think about how is it that we can rebuild and go back to the world that actually where the lives of all people are valued and support those fighting on the front lines. Jacinta.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of both of those comments, I think, today we did talk a lot about the big problems, the big issues, the big structures that we're up against. And I do think at sometimes it feels like we're, in this situation where we're trying to fight a huge system, a huge beast. But at least something that helps me is understanding that we really are just sort of up against the next chapter of what policing and militarization looks like. But we're standing on the shoulders of centuries of resistance, centuries of communities fighting back, finding strategies of being able to figure out how to defend communities, how to create alternatives, how to create the world that we're all fighting for that's more just and dignified and actually provides, real safety for communities that allows them to thrive. And so I think we weren't able to talk as much today about the organizing, but as much as we can talk about, Thomson Reuters, we can also talk about folks that are organizing local ordinances, right? And not just things that are talking about figuring out how to be, actually talking about bans, right? Banning some of these technologies, actually putting full stops to them. You talk about students that are organizing on their campus against these companies trying to push their services at their law schools. We're talking about investors that are actually voting in favor of shareholder resolutions, trying to hold these companies accountable. So there's actually a lot of ways in which we can see that people are organizing and pushing back and building up this analysis. I think it's up to all of us to just really have that clear-eyed picture to be able to make bold demands and believe that they're possible, because our organizing can make them true. We just have to continue to push in that direction and not just think that we can tinker around the edges to, add some transparency or add some little, sections here or there where people can say consent yes or no to their data, but actually be thinking about how we're thinking about the full-on economy of it all to be able to really use our power to change the world for what we want it to be.
Such an incredible note to end this discussion on. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight for this conversation. Thank you all to all of you who tuned in, and thank you so much for to Melanie and to the Highline for facilitating all of this.
Thank you all. Of course, always the end of these conversations feel like the jumping off point for the next one. But I really appreciate you spending time with us, Albert, Jacinta, Mizue, and Carin, in this excellent conversation. And I want to say a quick thank you to all of our colleagues who've made this program possible, especially Constanza Valenzuela, who's behind the scenes in this program today, as well as our advisors who've been guiding all of our public engagement around this project: the Center for Constitutional Rights, Immigrant Defense Project, Mijente, Media Justice, Empower Change, and Reprieve. And a quick thank you to the members of the Highline Plinth Committee, contemporary art leaders committed to realizing major commissions and engaging the public success of the Plinth program, of which this is one of many parts. And thank you, of course, to our attendees. So to learn more about many of the histories that our panelists have been referencing today, please join us on October 13th at 6 p.m. Eastern for our next conversation, the fifth in the event. This conversation is called Building Surveillance, 3 Chapters in U.S. History. And we're really thrilled to be joined by filmmaker and journalist Assia Boundaoui, scholar and writer Simone Brown, and Omar Farah from the Center for Constitutional Rights. The event will be moderated by Lily Irani, Associate Professor of Communications and Science Studies at the University of California, San Diego, and will illuminate 3 important chapters of U.S. surveillance history. Colonial times, kind of pre-9/11, 1970s to 1990s surveillance of Black and Muslim communities by the NYPD and FBI, and then post-9/11. And so to learn more about whatever our panelists have been speaking at today, and follow those different lineages, join us on the 13th. You can find the sign up link in the chat. And to learn more about all of this series and all of our programming, you can sign up for our newsletter, visit the Highline Art website, also linked in the chat. Thank you again, all, to be continued, and have a lovely evening and afternoon, depending on where you are, and we will see you soon.